This is a podcast all about heat networks, what they are and why they are important to a sustainable future. In addition, we'll discuss all the latest news and innovation in this rapidly growing industry. I'm part of the marketing team here at Switch2 Energy. Switch2 are experts in heat networks with over 35 years operating and maintaining community and district heated buildings. I've only been at Switch2 for 2 years and I'm still getting to grips with the tech in our industry. So join me on my learning curve as we find out what's to come for heat networks. This is episode 1. In this episode, we're going to be covering the basics of what heat networks are and why they are such a fast-growing part of a sustainable energy future. Our own Allan, Head of Market Strategy here at Switch2, will be on hand to share his expertise. We're also going to be focusing on the specific customer service challenges and opportunities that heat networks bring. Our second guest knows all about this and protecting heat network consumers. It's Stephen Knight, Managing Director of Heat Trust. Ian and Stephen, welcome to Get Heated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, Stephen, you're Managing Director at Heat Trust. Tell us all about the work that your organisation does.
Well, Heat Trust was created in the absence of there being statutory regulation of heat networks and heat supply. So if you get your heating from a gas boiler or from electric storage heating, then your supply of energy is regulated by Ofgem and you have lots of statutory rights provided under Ofgem's regulatory powers, and you have access to the Energy Ombudsman and so on. As a heat network consumers, until Heat Trust came along, you didn't have any of that. And so we provided an opportunity for heat network operators to register with our scheme and create the same sort of customer protections that gas and electric consumers have. Access to the Ombudsman, protection of vulnerable customers, and a whole suite of rules. At the moment, the scheme is voluntary. And so it's only those heat network operators that have registered their scheme with us are covered by the scheme. But we cover about 75,000 consumers at the moment.
And how long has Heat Trust actually been around for?
We were created in 2015 by an industry initiative working with government to create a scheme.
And Ian, tell us about your background at Switch2 and your experience working in this industry.
Yes, I started with Switch2 over 30 years ago, and Switch2 look after heat networks. So we've looked after residents on heat networks now for, I think, 45 years. And we started maintaining and metering and billing schemes, customers on heat networks. So we've seen a lot of change in those 30 or 40 years. And of course, we should remember that heat networks aren't actually new in the UK. They were installed in the 60s and 70s into many buildings as a way of delivering heat from coal cleanly. So we've seen a transition all the way from coal to gas, because those heat networks are now fired by gas. Now we expect to see an even bigger transition now to new fuel sources.
I think it's fair to say internationally they go back even further, don't they? I mean, there are a lot of heat networks globally that were built in the 1950s and earlier.
Yeah. That's right. And indeed, if you go to London, for example, they originally burnt coal in all the fireplaces. So they carried coal up to all the fireplaces, and all that burning coal, of course, ended up in smogs. And after that, the Clean Air Act was enacted to address this. And part of the result of that was you weren't allowed to burn coal in your individual fireplaces anymore. So what happened was they all put coal-fired boilers in the basements of the buildings and put heat networks into the buildings. And indeed, British Coal, when I started, British Coal operated many of the local authority housing schemes because they could deliver heat from coal, but burn the coal centrally, which was much cleaner than delivering it to everybody's houses. Yeah. And of course, that is basically what we're doing moving forward, as you'll see, no doubt, further in these series of podcasts.
So as we are talking about heat networks, so what is your most basic definition of what a heat network is?
In the UK, we are the most common form of heating is for a house to have a gas boiler. So gas is delivered to the house, and you have a gas boiler, and which the householder owns, and you convert the gas to heat in your home. A heat network, you don't actually convert the gas to heat in your home, you have a central boiler. So you might have, for example, a block of flats which has a central boiler, and the gases turn to heat in that central boiler, and then it's piped to your houses, to all the houses or the dwellings in the tower block, rather than as heat, rather than gas being delivered to the houses. So the actual heat, your experience as a householder, as a resident in a house, is very similar. Instead of having a gas boiler, you normally have a heat interface unit, which looks very like a gas boiler. And the heat that comes out of it, for your domestic hot water and your radiators, is very similar. So from that point of view, the technology point of view, you don't see much difference. Having said that, there is a difference in the way you pay for the heat, because it's usually your landlord or building owner or local authority, if it's a local authority housing scheme, who operate the heat network. It's not a big energy company, it's the building owner or local authority, and they're the people who then charge you for your heat. So you might be getting a bill for heat from your landlord or building owner, or indeed you might also be paying for the heat in your rent as well, so you don't actually get a bill. So that's probably the main difference from a consumer perspective, is the way you pay for it.
Many consumers actually have a relationship with an agent of their landlord, whether it be the managing agent of the block of flats, or whether it's a metering and billing company that the agent and the building owner have employed to do that. So I think from the customer's perspective, they often get a bill that's sort of branded one company for their heating and hot water, but actually it's the building owner who is supplying their hot water and heating. And I think that's often a confusion that we see with customers, and clarity on that I think is important. At the moment, most heat networks in the UK, as Ian said, are gas-fired, but in the future, of course, it's likely that there'll be communal heat pump systems, and indeed taking heat. One of the advantages of heat networks is they can take waste heat from remote sources and pipe them to people's homes. And so it does open up a wide variety of different heat sources, not just a gas boiler. And indeed, some of the historic ones, if you think about the Pimlico scheme in central London, that historically took waste heat from Battersea Power Station, which was a coal power station on the South Bank, piped it in a tunnel under the Thames to a council estate in Pimlico in Westminster. And that, I think, was probably a very early example of a heat network using waste heat from a power station that would otherwise just be dumped, be into the atmosphere, and using it productively to heat people's homes. So it's a bit broader than just communal gas boilers, but yes, a lot of them are at the moment simply communal gas boilers.
If you live in a local authority property in Sheffield, for example, you might be getting heat from the ERF, the Energy Recovery Facility,
waste incineration, yes.
That's right, which burns the heat. So whilst most are gas-fired, there are examples of what the future is going to look like already. And it was interesting, I was told on the Pimlico heat network that before they took the waste heat from the power station and used it for heating people's homes, they used to dump it into the River Thames, and it sanitized it.
Killed off all the stuff that the fish lived on, I suspect.
Yeah, that's right. So and once they started not dumping it in and actually using the heat, then the fish started coming back into the Thames.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get better in future at actually seeing energy as more of a circular economy, because at the moment we put a lot of energy into cooling buildings through air conditioning and also energy into heating them. And we often don't close that loop and take the waste heat from a cooling operation and use it to heat, provide heat. And I think we're going to have to get much better at that in future. And heat networks actually provide an opportunity to be better at doing that.
So you've mentioned waste heat being a source of energy. So what other types of energies do heat networks use?
Well, at the moment, as Ian said, a lot of it is gas-fired, and I think there will be a big move to electrify heat pumps, air source, ground source, water source heat pumps. Waste heat can be in many different forms. I mean, it can be high-temperature waste heat from a waste incinerator or an industry. It could be fairly low-grade heat from the sewers under our feet, or from mine water, it's often talked about, or indeed things like data centers generate lots of heat. So there are lots of different sources. Some of it high temperature waste heat that could be used directly to heat, some of it relatively low temperature that might require a heat pump to make it a bit hotter for practical use. So there are lots of different opportunities and ways in which we might get heat in the future.
Okay.
But I think, obviously to get to net zero, we need to do away with fossil fuels eventually.
Yeah, I was going to say, which one out of all the ones that you've said would you say is the best in terms of like going forward?
I would say there's no one solution, that it depends where you are and what resources you've got around you. In a city where or in a location where you've got mines, you'll use mine heat. If you've got a river next to you, you'll use the heat from the river. You'll take heat out of the river. If you've got industry next to you, which has excess heat, waste industry, like a glass factory, for example, or a food processing plant, then you'll use the heat. And of course, data centers as well. You'll use the heat from the data centers. So there's no one solution. It's going to be a combination of all those solutions.
And it may even involve planning to put our industry that requires lots of heat co-located somewhere where there's a big heat source. So you take something like a nuclear power station being built, generates vast amounts of waste heat on a low carbon basis, and you could put an industry that requires that heat on the doorstep and make good use of that. So I think it does require much more creative planning about where we put things and how we potentially move heat around.
And another thing that you mentioned was communal boilers. So something that I've learned recently, there's actually a difference between district heat networks and communal heat networks. Are you able to explain what the difference is?
Well, I think typically we talk about communal heat networks as being a heat network that serves a single building. I think that there's a bit of grey area around this where there's a development by a single developer with several buildings on the site, whether that's classed as communal or district, is slightly hazy. But I think that the legal definitions in regulation talks about buildings, and whether it's a single building or multiple buildings. But I think typically district, we tend to mean where you've got one energy centre or a series of energy centre and pipes running in public areas servicing a number of different buildings of different types, and covering potentially whole cities with a wide scale network. And so I think in future you could, for instance, see a lot of blocks of flats with communal heating joined up to a wider district network and take their heat, instead of from local boilers in the basement, take their heat from a wider district heat network that could itself be taking heat from waste incinerators, riverside heat pumps, all sorts of different sources, rather than separate buildings all doing their own heat generation.
Yeah, communal heating is really where the building owns and operates the heat network on a small scale. So a single building or perhaps a couple of buildings.
Sometimes quite big scale. I mean, sometimes 1,000 residents some of these sites. But it is limited to their own buildings rather than providing a heat supply to a whole community.
And a district heating network is when you have an energy company who builds a big...
Or a local authority.
Who builds a big energy centre in a city and then digs up the streets and pipes heat to various buildings. There's one in Sheffield. There's a large energy recovery facility which takes the household waste from around Sheffield, burns it, and then generates heat and electricity. And the heat is piped to 150 buildings or more right across Sheffield.
And indeed here in Leeds.
There's
a city centre district heat system called Leeds Pipes. Yeah. That's a big growing network as well.
So Stephen, what would you say the benefits are of heat networks for both the environment and residents?
Well, I think there are many. I mean, one of the benefits actually is safe building safety, fire safety, because if you imagine piping gas to every apartment in a block of flats, the risk of fire and explosion would be very high, and therefore, it's not typically allowed under building regulations for buildings above a certain size. So the advantage of generating that heat centrally and then piping the hot water around is much safer. There's also the benefit of the communal nature of the capital investment required in the kit, particularly when you think about decarbonisation and heat pumps in the future. The capital costs of building boreholes in the ground and all that kind of stuff is quite high. And high for individual households to do, but if you do it on a communal basis, you can share that cost amongst everybody on the heat network. If you ask me what the disbenefits are, that's a different question. But when you're piping heat around, you often lose some of that heat in the process. And so one of the things which future regulation is looking at is how do we minimize heat losses, because heat losses are a big issue on heat networks and they can lead to poor consumer outcomes. So there are pros and cons, but critically, I think safety is one of them that's very important. And secondly, this kind of sharing the capital costs of the infrastructure of generating and distributing that heat is really important. And there ought to be benefits around reliability of heat as well, in my view, because if you've got a professionally run energy centre, it ought to be more reliable. You can afford to have backup boilers if your boiler goes down, things like that. Sometimes we don't always see that in practice in the industry at the moment, but hopefully that's something that will come.
And I think the other one is clean. Is heat networks are cleaner than doing things individually, especially with gas.
Yeah.
And the other sort of bigger issue is that the way heat is going to go is we're going to electrify heat. But the problem is that the peak requirement for heat is 6 or 7 times greater than the grid's ability to deliver, to create that heat, because the gas peak demand that gas can service is significantly higher than our electricity grid can serve. So whilst it's easy to say we'll put individual heat pumps in all the houses we've got, the grid will not be able to support that, especially when you consider electric vehicles as another demand on the grid. So we're going to have to find alternatives to direct heating or individual heat pumps where we can use the electricity from the grid more effectively to generate heat. And that means supplementing it with
and
other
I think
sources.
Also it means heat storage.
Yeah.
One of the things you can do on a heat network is you can have quite big central heat stores. If you look at heat networks in some parts of Europe, they have massive heat stores, which are essentially very large tanks of water, which can store heat between seasons. You can heat them up in the summer and use that heat in the winter. That's very long-term storage of heat.
Yeah,
but actually, even just generating heat at times of the day when the demand on the grid is low, and then using that heat at other times of day really helps in all this grid management stuff. And heat networks provide an opportunity to manage all of these issues much more effectively.
So with a large-scale heat pump, you can run the heat pump overnight when demand's really low and there's a lot of excess electricity. So you've got wind farms that are working. You can store that heat in thermal stores. And then at peak times during the day, when everyone gets up in the morning or when everyone comes home for tea
everyone
time.
Turns on the hot tap or gets under the shower.
And you're using that's right. And you're using the stored heat rather than the electricity from the grid at peak time. And that both means you can optimize the grid, but more importantly, it means it's cheaper as well. You're using cheaper electricity to generate your heat than you would be if you had a heat pump on that's on all day, an individual heat pump on that's on all day, and you have to keep it running at peak times.
When you could do this on an individual home base, of course, you can have hot water tanks. We always used to have in homes hot water tanks before combi boilers became so popular. Everyone would have a hot water tank. And we become used to having massively powerful combi boilers which can generate peak demand there and then when you want it, simply by, having very, burning huge amounts of gas in one go and generating lots of heat. But actually, it's much more efficient to use energy on a more gradual basis to build up the heat and then take it off a store when you need it. But of course, not everybody can fit in, particularly in a big block of flats. It's not efficient to have lots of little hot water cylinders. Much more efficient to have one big thermal store.
And you're managing that as well, having the control systems to manage. When you have individual control systems, and we see that with controls in buildings, they're set up incorrectly. They never get set correctly. Whereas if you do it centrally, you have a big industrial heat pump and you have a big industrial store, it's going to be operated efficiently. It's difficult to do that if you have lots of small, distributed, expensive systems.
Right. And who would maintain the bigger communal boiler?
Well, it depends at what scale. If it's at large scale, like in Sheffield, that would be an energy company like E.ON or Veolia or SSE, the big energy companies. If it's in a smaller communal system, that might be an energy services company that the building owner or the site owner employs
ultimately
to
be
do
the
it.
building owner, wouldn't it, who would be responsible for that?
And they would employ specialists to operate that system. Yeah.
Right. So, Ian, we hear a lot that the UK government has a target to increase the number of homes on heat networks from the current 3% to 20% by 2050. Why are heat networks going to be so important in the future?
Okay, heat networks are going to be important for a number of reasons. One reason that we've already mentioned is that the electricity distribution grid isn't going to be able to keep up with individual demand for heating systems. Secondly, we've got to get rid of gas. So we've got to get rid of gas. We've got to stop burning gas. We've got to stop burning gas in our homes. So we have to find an alternative. The alternative could be individual heat pumps, but the electricity grid won't have the capacity to service individual heat pumps in every house. So where we've got cities where we've got dense buildings, lots of buildings together, a much more efficient way of doing that is to use a heat network. And the heat network can use other sources of heat. So we can use waste heat. We can use heat that comes out, we take out of the rivers. We can use heat that comes out of disused mines, for example, and industry. So lots of cities have data centers in them. They have processing plants. They even have buildings where we have a lot of air conditioning, waste heat from air conditioning as well, which we should really be using. It's not the only solution. There's going to be a mixture of solutions. So there's no one magic bullet to this. So we're going to have to think a range of solutions, and some solutions will be better in certain scenarios. Heat networks are likely to be the best option in where you've got dense housing, where you've got cities, you've got towns, you've got lots of housing and lots of buildings together. Whereas individual solutions will be where you've got less dense housing, you've got more remote housing.
I think it comes down to some extent to it being a huge challenge to decarbonise the way we heat, because we've got used to these incredibly easy, cheap things called gas boilers, which are, in everybody, well, not everybody's home, but most of us have got them in our homes. We've got to move away from that, but that's a big challenge. It's not always going to be a cheap challenge to put in alternative infrastructure, and it's not quite going to be as convenient. And I think that what heat networks offer the opportunity to do is to share the cost and difficulty of decarbonising the heat across communities. So it's not about individual home owners, households having to do it themselves. It can be done on a communal or district basis. And I think that's a real game changer, particularly, as Ian says, in those urban areas where you've got lots of houses and lots of flats close together, where it makes sense to do it on a communal basis. And, if you look around many parts of Europe, this is commonplace today and has been for many, many decades.
And the reason for that is because there's only the UK and perhaps the Netherlands which actually have North Sea gas.
Yeah, absolutely. If it wasn't for cheap North Sea gas, we would have done this before.
That's right. And we stopped all those heat networks that, when I started, were in the heat network industry, were coal-fired and being operated by British Coal as a way of delivering coal cleanly, and that have now been converted to gas. And what happened was they stopped putting heat networks in because we found North Sea gas, and we started rolling out in the UK. We rolled out gas networks rather than heat networks. But if you go to Scandinavia or go to Germany or you go to France even, you'll find many more heat networks because they didn't have access to North Sea gas. And
the entire Eastern Bloc, the former Soviet countries of Europe, and indeed Russia and large parts of China, all built around heat network heating. I mean, you look at Ukraine as an example, which we in the news a lot these days. Almost every home in the Ukraine is heated by a heat network, with big communal boilers.
Yeah, I think the statistics for Germany is 70% of room space is heated by a communal heat network or a heat network.
So we've fallen behind a little bit there.
Yeah, because we had access to North Sea gas, and it's mean we've had a cheap, convenient alternative. But now that's obviously no longer.
That's not going to be an option for very much longer, is it? I mean, the gas will run out, and even if it doesn't run out, we can't go on burning it.
Well, it has in effect run out in many ways. I mean, we're importing a lot of gas from America and across around the world.
So do you think these targets are actually achievable? So to get to 20% by 2050?
Yeah, no doubt they are, yes. I'm sure. it will largely depend on government policy and rolling out that policy, but but that is looking positive. The Energy Security Bill enacted last year contains the provision for not only the regulation of heat networks, but also for heat network zoning, which is going to create areas where it will be mandatory to connect to heat networks.
I think if we're going to succeed in decarbonising heating, and I think that is something we cannot fail to do if we're going to protect the planet. If we're going to succeed in that, then I think we're going to have to achieve the kind of 20%, probably 20% plus.
Yeah,
I think heat from heat networks, and I suspect actually there's a good chance that 20% will be just the starting point.
It's interesting because where cities like Nottingham and like Sheffield have heat networks that were put in the 70s, there is no shortage of people wanting to connect. Their problem is capacity. So once the heat network's there, people want to connect because it is safer and it's cleaner than using alternatives such as gas.
I think that's right. I mean, we have struggled with certain, the lack of statutory regulation around this sector. Now, some of that, as Ian says, the Energy Act 2023 is set the framework for bringing all that in. So hopefully we will be in a much stronger place to grow the sector and deliver these decarbonisation targets through heat networks going forward. But I think there is still, probably not enough policy clarity from government to deliver where we need to go. And so there's a lot more to do. But it is eminently achievable with the right policy direction.
Thank you. So talking about regulations, Stephen, what are regulations and what does this mean for heat networks?
Well, as Ian says, there was an Energy Act enacted last year in 2023 that gave the government the power to regulate the sector. Now, that included a wide range of measures. Key amongst there is consumer protection. So putting in place Ofgem, the energy ombudsman, giving consumers the same sort of rights and protections that gas and electricity consumers have enjoyed for a long time. I think that's really essential if this is going to be a technology that becomes much more common. As part of this, there will be new standards around technical performance of heat networks. And a lot of the consumer detriment issues that we see in the market at the moment are because a lot of heat networks have been poorly installed, poorly designed, poorly maintained, and poorly operated. And that leads to inefficiency and often unreliable heat for consumers. So we need to address that. The new scheme that will come in as part of this regulation will mean much stricter standards for how heat networks are built and installed and operated in future, including cleaning up the act for a lot of existing heat networks and getting them to be improved, brought up to higher standards. And that's good. There's some questions about how it's going to be paid for still, I have to say, but I think it's really, really positive. So we're going to have better heat networks. We're going to have proper consumer protections. There's also, as part of regulations, what's been mentioned around zoning, which is giving powers for government and particularly local government to plan out where heat networks are going to go, appoint developers, ensure that all of the existing communal networks can be joined up and so on. So a real effective strategic planning powers, hopefully. It's still to be delivered. But that's the plan. And of course, there are other measures as well around things like rules around decarbonising existing networks and so on. But a whole suite of regulations really aimed at modernising and bringing the heat network sector up to standard. Because if it's going to be delivering 20% of heat to consumers nationwide, it's got to be doing that reliably, cost effectively, and to high standards. And I think hopefully we'll get an industry that will deliver that.
And part of that is this podcast is raising the awareness of heat networks, because in the UK, of course, heat networks, people don't understand heat networks. Everyone understands a gas boiler. And lots of people who are involved with buildings, with heat networks, don't really understand what they are and what's needed to make them work properly, and raising the profile. The more people understand about heat networks, the better we're going to get at operating them and delivering good service to residents.
I think that public understanding of heat networks is utterly critical. I mean, even we see a lot of consumers who are living on heat networks that don't even know they're living on heat networks. Often, they have this box in the cupboard in their service cupboard that they think is a gas boiler because it looks like a gas boiler. It's got a meter on it, provides heating and hot water, and they don't realise. And so I think, and that can lead to all sorts of problems with, when they eventually get a bill and they think, what's this bill for? It's really vital, I think, that we improve communication and understanding by consumers of what heat networks are, how they're regulated in the future, and what their rights as a consumer are if they're on a heat network.
And how do you think we can communicate that better, or building owners communicate that better to their residents?
Certainly, I think that one of the things that Ofgem will regulate is that Ofgem will require building owners to give residents, and not just residents, actually, people before they move in to a flat or a home, should be given information about the heating system that they're going to have as part of that home. At the moment, there's no mandatory requirement to be told that when you're buying a flat or a house, that's on a heat network, that it's on a heat network. And I think part of regulation that hopefully will improve that flow of communication. It will improve the sort of information that heat network operators, building owners, have to give to their customers on a regular basis, the frequency with which they do it. And I think all of that will help the customer. And simple things like rules about having to give notice of price changes and so on, which sometimes are not often done these days.
One of the differences that a resident on a heat network sees compared to those on gas with gas boilers is that they can't switch supplier. You're living in a building with a heat network, and you have to take heat from that heat network. So there's an opportunity. Whilst personally, I think the right to switch supplier is overrated in the gas and electricity market.
In practice, no one's been able to do it in the last 2 years.
That's right. It will give residents an opportunity to get involved in the decisions being made about their heat network. Because, of course, if your heat network is operated by a building owner, the building owner can switch supply at the gas and electricity supply, to get better prices. So there is an opportunity for residents to get more involved in the decision making about the heat network that they live on as well.
I think that's right, and I think it's also likely that future reform to leasehold is likely to give leaseholders in particular, a much bigger role in managing their own buildings and in overseeing the way their buildings are managed in future. And so I think all of that will hopefully increase transparency for customers and for residents.
Yeah. I think it's always the case that things work better when you have informed customers. So residents on heat networks, when the more informed they are, the better for everybody, really. And the better service they're going to receive, the better operated the heat networks will be. So we're looking forward to that.
Right. So Stephen, as Heat Trust are all about protecting heat network customers, what advice could you give to heat network operators that are listening now on how they can improve customer service to meet heat network consumer needs?
Well, communicate with your customers, set out the terms and conditions of supply very clearly. I mean, ultimately, I would say register with the Heat Trust scheme, because then you will have terms of supply which are measured to be up to scratch, and you'll have assurance that your terms and conditions of supply are effectively regulation ready. and they are equivalent to the sort of terms that a gas or electric customer would have. So I think you can look at certainly our scheme rules and look at what those say and talk to us about that. But I think broadly speaking, it's about communicating with your residents. It's about understanding the needs of your residents. So, for instance, understanding where you've got residents in vulnerable situations or residents who have additional needs, the communication and so on. Are you meeting their needs? And ensuring critically that you're running your heating system as efficiently and as reliably as possible. Because a lot of the complaints and problems that we see are due to frequent interruptions to supply or very high costs due to inefficient operations. So addressing those issues and addressing communication and engagement with customers and understanding customer needs, I think is critical.
I think as far as efficiency goes, it's really important now because of the energy crisis and that gas is twice the cost it used to be. So running or improving the efficiency of your schemes pays significant dividends and brings down the cost. And of course, that addresses fuel poverty as well. I think one of the things that operators, perhaps certainly in the residential sector, don't probably understand is that heat networks aren't like normal heating systems in a building or a house. They need a more specialist type of maintenance. They operate 24 hours a day, 360 days a year, so they are often operating at very low demand periods, which is very unlike how a gas heating system in your house or in a office block would work, where it's either on or off. So I think more attention to specialist maintenance and end-to-end maintenance, and indeed, unlike in the gas with a gas boiler, a resident has more impact, impact on the efficiency of the whole system. As long as the HIU or the heat interface unit, which is in the apartment, if that's not serviced, not only it has an impact on the customer in the apartment, but it also robs heat from the rest of the residents that are on the scheme. So it's really important, that more important than with the gas network and gas boilers, that there is maintenance is carried out and on the HIUs and heat networks.
I think that's absolutely right, because the heat network is a fairly complex machine, isn't it? It's not just the boiler at one end, but it's all the pumps and valves and everything else that ensures that heat is circulating in the right way around the building. Yeah. One thing I would plug to anybody who's running a heat network now is the government has something called the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, which is a funding scheme which makes available money to do two things. One is to have an optimization study, it's called, of your heat network. So fully funded by government. They will come in and look at how your network is operating, how efficient it is, and draft a kind of schedule of what you can do to put it right. And secondly, they will pay 50% of the capital costs of that work needed to put it right. And that funding pot is available until 2028. So we've got several years of funding. Now, it's not enough to cover all the work needed at every heat network, but apply now and get that done, because in a few years' time, you're going to start having legal obligations to put these things right. And if you leave it till then, there may not be government funding to help you with those costs.
And would you be able to advise how they can apply for the funding?
Yeah, look online on the government website for the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, and there's application information is all on the government website.
Yeah. We're very supportive of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme, and it's a really important improving standards. But I would add that maintenance is first. Maintenance, you can do so much by improving the efficiency with good maintenance, and efficiency improvements have diminishing returns. The more efficient heat network gets, the less improvement you see, especially in finance and carbon emissions. Maintenance can take you a long way up that efficiency ladder, so you get a really good return on investment by improving maintenance.
And certainly poor maintenance or lack of maintenance can cause a lot of problems, both with efficiency and also with reliability.
Yeah, and it's not just the efficiency, it's poorly maintained plant breaks down and needs replacing earlier. We've had horror stories of communal boilers only lasting 6 years when they should last 20 odd years.
Or longer. I mean, I think one of the issues that's often talked about in the industry is around the quality of water circulating heat networks, water quality. And if you get that wrong and you don't invest in ensuring the water quality, it's something as simple as that. As Ian says, your plant can simply corrode away in a few years' time when it should be lasting 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, or more. 90 years for some of the pipe work.
Absolutely. This is a machine that requires to be properly maintained, properly serviced, and operated by somebody who knows what they're doing. Yeah. It's not something where you can just get a jobbing plumber in once a year to give it a quick once over. That's not how this needs to be operated.
I suppose the key thing with good maintenance is to link it to efficiencies. So your maintenance contractors really should be incentivized to improve the efficiency, not just keep the system working. So that means you have to measure the efficiency as well, and many heat networks don't measure the efficiency of the and you need one contractor that takes the responsibility for the whole network, and they need to be specialist contractors. Too often we see non-specialist contractors trying to look after heat networks when they don't have the skill.
And I guess one of the important things is actually monitoring and recording the data about the performance of your heat network and actually understanding what the efficiency is, what the flow temperatures are, what the return temperatures are, how hard the pumps are having to work and all the rest of it, and understanding how your heat network is performing in real time. And I think a lot of particularly older heat networks don't necessarily have the infrastructure in there to measure their own performance and to report on that. One of the things Ofgem will be looking to is actually every heat network operator reporting regularly, even monthly, but probably more frequently in terms of real time in some cases, in performance of heat networks in order to monitor efficiency and performance. So I think a lot of investment in kit is going to be needed to properly understand that, and that will lead to being able to improve all those performance issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't manage if you don't measure.
I suppose it's probably one thing that's worth adding is that there are quite a lot of heat networks still in the UK where there aren't individual heat meters for the customer, and the customers build on a kind of shared cost basis, often with their rent. And a lot of the older local authority heat networks are like this. And in that case, the customer doesn't, because they haven't got a meter, and they don't have very much control over the heat either. They have no real way of reducing their bills by using less because they get billed the same amount, whatever. And I think one of the things regulation is likely to mean is that investment has to happen in improving all of those older heat networks and putting in individual meters. And obviously that's a challenge for some of the local authorities and housing associations that run those estates. They're going to have to start doing proper metering operations and billing operations and so on, which at the moment they don't have to do.
Yeah, but they're probably burning twice as much gas as they actually need, because there's no controls and there's no incentives.
And that's bad for the residents because it costs a lot, and it's also bad for the planet because you're burning lots of gas wastefully.
So there will be a lot of the payback on installing meters and charging people by what they use is significantly advantageous, and addresses fuel poverty and brings down the overall costs significantly.
As we move forward towards a future where heat networks are far more common, where can companies like Switch2 and organisations like Heat Trust be helpful? Ian, do you want to start us off with this one?
Switch2, we manage heat networks, and what we offer is a specialist heat network management service. So we both specialise in the technology of running the heat networks, measuring the performance of the heat networks, but also in the resident care and the resident communications as well. So we can offer a specialist end-to-end service, specialist heat network service, and we can guarantee the performance of your heat network, and we can guarantee the life of your equipment. We'll maintain it in a way that prolongs the life of your equipment, so we can guarantee you won't get early breakdowns and be replacing your equipment more than you need, and that the efficiencies will be the best they can be in that building, and we'll measure it to prove that it is so.
And presumably help your clients with fulfilling all the regulatory duties which
That's true. Yes,
Ofgem will require of them.
Yes, that's right. So yes, we'll take on the responsibility to ensure that your heat network is operated in accordance with the regulations, and metering and billing as well. We will carry out the metering and billing function, and we have smart metering systems which give residents the information that they need to manage their bills.
I think from Heat Trust perspective, I mean, we're in a kind of unique situation where we've been working towards doing ourselves out of business in a sense, because we're working towards an environment where a voluntary regulation scheme isn't needed anymore, because there's a statutory one that covers everybody. That's the ideal. So there won't be a need for a voluntary heat trust scheme once full regulation's in place. But that would still take some years to be fully in place. So we're not going away anytime soon. There will always be a need for somebody to champion the consumer in this market. And Citizens Advice will have a statutory responsibility for that as part of regulation. But I think it's really important as we grow this market that consumer confidence is central to that, because ultimately we want consumers to have a good experience, and so they want to be on a heat network. It turns out to be ultimately it needs to be ultra reliable, the lowest cost form of decarbonised heat, and something that everybody wants because it's simple and easy. That's what we've got to deliver, and that's hopefully what regulations will ensure universally for everybody.
That's right. And it'll introduce standards as well.
Absolutely.
Introducing standards makes it easier for heat network operators to deliver reliable service as well.
This is an industry and sector that is rapidly expanding. What do you think are the main challenges and opportunities within this industry?
I think the challenge is to get it right, make sure that heat networks are operating effectively in future. So we've had a history of some poor heat networks being implemented in the UK. The challenge is that in the future, every heat network will be efficient and reliable and deliver high quality and reliable heat for consumers. We need a regulatory framework that ensures consumers are properly protected and that this is a form of heat that everybody wants. So if you get your consumer confidence bit right, then the sector can move forward. And then I think there's a challenge about how we deliver decarbonisation of heat. It's not about, growing of heat networks, from my perspective, is not an end in its own right. It's about a mechanism to enable us to decarbonise heating across the UK, homes, offices, industry, workplaces, etc. And if we get it right, it will enable us to achieve that end in a cost-effective way. And that's the objective. As I say, let's move away from burning lots of fossil fuels and spending lots of money on fossil fuels, and move towards employing people to do it properly.
So that's all for today. Thank you, Ian Allan from Switch2 and Stephen Knight from Heat Trust. And thank you guys for watching Get Heated. We are a new podcast looking to grow, so please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider. Leave us a review and tell your friends about us. Remember, if you want to find out more about how Switch2 can help you develop smart and sustainable heat network solutions, just go to switch2.co.uk. That's all for now. We'll be back next month with another episode of Get Heated.